So let's talk about how programming and scripting affects the AZ-103 exam. I do get this question from time to time. Is there programming on the AZ-103 test? Strictly speaking, there is not programming in the AZ-103 test. You do not need to know how to access the .NET APIs, the Azure APIs using .NET or Java or any other programming language. But there is scripting, and it's a pretty fine line, I agree. But scripting is an important part of being an administrator with Azure. Now, there are three main ways of accessing your resources within Azure. Now, Azure Portal is the one that we're going to be using the most because it's a point-and-click interface. It's also the most visual. But there is also two command lines that you can use to access your resources. One is PowerShell, and the other is called CLI, which sometimes people call Bash as well. Now, the other programming aspect would be JSON. Now, JSON is a templating language that's used for defining resources in a template, and you'll also get JSON response from some of your command lines. Now, at this point, some people say, well, I don't want to learn programming. I don't need to learn programming. The scripting thing seems unnecessary to my job. Why do I need this? The most important reason why you want to learn scripting is automation, right? A very important part of being an administrator is being able to simplify tasks, be able to repeat tasks, sort of having scripts in your library that you can then run if you want to ever create a virtual machine or create a user or to perform some reliable task. You might want to automate that as opposed to having to remember how to do it each time. You can also put these scripts into a source control. So if you use GitHub, you can check in these scripts and that becomes, the source of truth for how you do certain things, and you can track changes over time. You can reduce errors when you do things repetitively. So when you have a 10-step process, do a deployment, for instance, to have that as a scripted task instead of having to remember each step is going to reduce errors. We're all human. We all make mistakes. We skip steps, put them out of order, etc., typos. Finally, scripts are a living form of documentation. So you may not want to sit down and write out in a Microsoft Word document all the things that you do on your job. But if you have a robust library of scripts, another person can come along, look at your scripts, and they'll see exactly how you implement security and how you implement policies, etc. Okay, so it's a living form of documentation because if you're using the scripts, then that's an accurate representation of how you do things as opposed to a regular Word document, which could have been written 3 years ago, and nobody's really sure if it's up to date. And you can ask around, is this the most recent documentation? No one's ever going to give you a 100% guarantee that documentation's up to date. But scripts, if they're being used, are up to date. Now, we talked about the portal, and we're going to get into the portal a lot more in this course, but for now, it is portal.azure.com to get to the portal within your web browser. You can sign up for a free account if you don't have one, or use your account that you have. And in most of this course, we're going to be using the portal, so it's a good reference to have. Now, talking about scripting and PowerShell and things like that, how is it going to appear on the test? Is Microsoft going to ask you to write a script? Are you going to have to sit down and perform tasks using a pre-formatted script? Not really, right? They don't actually have you writing code or writing scripts and submitting it to them. But they do have this method called performance-based testing. Some people call them labs. Now, performance-based testing will fire up an actual living instance of Microsoft Azure and ask you to perform a set of tasks. Okay, so there might be 6 or 7 things you need to do. A lot of them apparently are independent of each other, so you're not given 6 things to do that have to be done in a row. You're asked to create a virtual network with the following name. You're asked to create a virtual machine in one of the existing virtual networks. You're asked to do this over here within this resource group, etc., etc. So the tasks should be fairly separate, but you're given a living, working, live instance of Azure and asked to perform that set of tasks. Now, you are given the freedom to perform that task any way that you know how. So if it's through the portal, you can do it that way. If it is through the scripting like PowerShell and CLI, you can do it that way. So however you perform the task, as long as you do what they ask you to do, they're going to have on the back end the ability to check that it's got done. They won't follow how you did it. They'll just know, I asked you to create a virtual network with the following name, containing 2 subnets with the following names, and you were able to create those 3 things, and we verified that they got created. The second method that you're going to be asked coding, scripting type questions is that the question itself will have some sort of code in it, and you'll be asked in the answers whether that code performs the required task. So it might say, here's the scenario. The user wants to ensure that only this person gets access to the resource group and no other people can get access to it. Does the following code accomplish this? And it'll show you the code and you can decide yes or no, it accomplishes the task. The other way will for you to have a line of missing code, and you choose from, the following sets of code, which the following code completes the task. Or Microsoft loves these drag and drop questions. The test is only 50% multiple choice in that traditional sense. And so you'll find code on the screen and you have to drag the correct components and the correct words, which is the parameter for this, which is the value that goes where, from the left into the right to complete the script. So drag and drop will be also a common type of coding. Now, in terms of scripting, we're going to talk about doing this on your local in a second, but Microsoft actually provides you a command line interface within the browser. So if you go to portal.azure.com, you'll see this little icon I'm highlighted here that is a greater than sign with an underscore. That represents the Azure Cloud Shell. Now, the Azure Cloud Shell, when you click it, you go through, there's a setup process and you have to create a storage account just for the Cloud Shell. But you can choose either a Bash or PowerShell, and you're given a command line terminal right within your browser. And you can use that command line terminal to execute commands. So you can change from Bash or to PowerShell. And right from there, you can have, since it's a storage account, you can store scripts in there. So if you have reliable scripts that you always run, they're stored inside your Azure storage account, or you can just type in commands and get the Cloud Shell to do them. So on the test, if you need to do something in the command line, you can just pull up the Cloud Shell and perform your task from there. So you'll see I can run the PowerShell version check in Cloud Shell. So that is the greater than sign underscore. It's in the portal in the top menu bar. Now, I want to close out this video with some tips or some advice for studying and taking this PowerShell CLI and the scripting elements of this test. So first of all, you'll notice that the question will come up asking for you to complete the code, but you don't get to choose whether you prefer PowerShell or CLI. And so it's up to you to know both. Luckily, there's some intuition. We'll talk about that in a second, but you don't get to choose the language. It's going to ask you, what's the, here's a command. What are the required parameters and what are the values that go into it? And you need to know PowerShell to answer those kind of questions. Obviously, you're going to need to get hands-on practice. And so it's very important that you have your own portal account, get your own free account or use your corporate account, and get in there and start creating resources using the portal, use PowerShell from time to time, and use CLI. And I'm going to try to add more resources to this course for those elements, but flip around between the three of them. And with the exam itself, particularly with labs, they're not perfect. Even 9 months now later since they've sort of come out, I am seeing lots of people having various problems with it. So make sure you leave yourself lots of time. Do not spend too much time on the question part of the test and then leave the labs. And then when you get to the labs, realize you only had 30 minutes and there's problems start to come up. It's slow. It takes them 20 minutes to resolve. So give yourself lots of time for the labs and don't waste time on other questions. Okay, so that's sort of the overall tip for the labs part of the test.